All right, so the RBAC API declares four kinds of Kubernetes objects. We have roles, role binding, cluster role binding. So here is the diagram that we see here. And so we have roles, which is a set of permissions for a particular namespace, and then cluster role, which is a set of permission across all namespaces. There are some Kubernetes components that cannot be namespace. So I would imagine that if you had to give them permissions, they'd have to be in cluster role, or there are components that can be in more than one namespace at the same time. So again, maybe that's where cluster role might play a part. So that's the reason for the two different ones. In order for roles or cluster roles to be bound to a subject, that's where you're going to need a binding. And so for a role, you have a role binding. For a cluster role, you have a cluster role binding. And so those are going to attach to subjects, which are just essentially identities, like a user account, which would be a single user, a service account, which represents a machine user to be used by an application service, a group, which is a group of users or service accounts. And just notice here that for both, we do have this binding in between each one. And the thing is that when you're using cloud service providers or other things with RBAC, you usually don't have to worry about that component. But in the world of Kubernetes, where everything is decoupled and you can see all the components underneath, we have to manage that component. So it's not too hard to use. And just to kind of tell you a little bit about machine user, just because this one, what's its service kind of threw me off, but then when I realized it was a machine user, it made sense. But if you don't even know what a machine user is, that's like, let's say you are on GitHub and, or like you have a project that you want to deploy to a server, but you need to have access to GitHub. So you go and you can use your main GitHub account, but that might have access to all your repositories, and that's just too much permission. So what you do is you create a new user with the intent to be used for deployment. So it only has access to the repo and permissions to read and things like that. And so that's the idea behind a machine user. It's for the usage of service. It's not tied to a specific person. Okay.